Greetings and welcome back to Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel. Today I want to talk about drought and drought stress in your gardens because here in the Northeast, I'm filming this on and it will be released on Memorial Day weekend, and this is our traditional planting season. Right? This is the start of the big push to get all the gardens in. If you're a little bit south of me, yes, you probably already have your stuff in. If you're up in Canada, you're probably waiting a few more weeks yet. But this is timely for our climate here, northern Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, that sort of area. This is very, very timely. So also in this area, we're headed into a year that's expected to be dominated by what might end up being the strongest El Nino on record. This is coming off of a triple dip La Nina, which is, to the best of my knowledge, only the second time that one of those has ever been recorded. Both of those patterns have a tendency to give us dry weather here in the Northeast. This is something you need to watch. Even if you're not watching this from, the mid-Atlantic states, you need to go do a little reading, do a little research on your area, your context, your climate, and how it is impacted by the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Okay? That is the overall water pattern and water temperature oscillation that drives El Nino, La Nina, neutral phase, those sorts of things. The Pacific Ocean takes up so much of the Earth's surface that it, as a system, has an impact on weather and climate everywhere around the globe. So no matter where you're watching this from, those things I said at the beginning of this video impact you somehow. Some of you, they're going to give wet conditions. Some of you, they'll give average. Some of you, they'll give dry. But you need to know how it relates to you, okay? You also need to have some humility and recognize that we're trying to predict a year's weather based on something that's happening half a world away. And as soon as you think you figured out the weather, it's going to make a liar out of you, right? That's just how the weather works. But if you know something about these overall patterns and trend lines, you will make better garden decisions on average than somebody who does not understand these patterns and trend lines. Okay? So that's my first thing. Now, we've had 3 really, really dry years, 2 of which were severe droughts and we're going into what might be another severe drought year. May or may not. I hope not, but it could be. The water table here is way down from where it normally is. When I drive around the area and I look at the trout streams, they're lower than they have any right to be this early in the season. So we're starting at a water deficit going into a dry year. You need to understand that and think it through as you're doing your garden prep. Okay? So what can we do to mitigate this situation? First, keep track of how much rain you're actually getting. That's really easy. For the last 2 weeks, we've had 0 rain. Okay? But get yourself something that you're going to use as your rain gauge, right? That doesn't have to be an official rain gauge. It can be a piece of, it could be a freezer container that you put, that you anchor to the ground somehow, right? But keep track of rain. When you're expecting rain, put a bucket out and see how much you got. Okay? If you're not getting a full inch of rain in a week, that was a drought week. That's what most of your plants need to thrive. That's what your seeds need to germinate. Okay? Watering and keeping track of water starts when you plant the seed. I remember last year I heard a lot of neighbors and a lot of people complaining that they had terrible seed germination, must be bad seed. No, your seed was probably fine. Unless you went to a cheap store and bought 4 for $1 seed packets, then it's probably not fine. But other than that, your seed was probably fine, okay? You didn't water your seed. Seed to germinate requires good soil contact with mineral soil and hydration through the entire germination process. If you don't provide it with that, you'll smoke your seed and you'll never see the plants emerge. So tracking water and watering your beds starts when you plant the seed. That's the first thing. Then you need to water through the season. If you don't get an inch of rain, you need to provide an inch of rain worth of water. Again, I talk to a lot of people about this that, say something about not having a great year last year. And I'll ask them if they watered. They'll say, well, yeah, I watered. Well, how much water did you give? Well, I don't know how much water I give. I just sprayed them with the hose. Wrong. You didn't give them enough water. Okay? If you want to spray your plants with a hose, first of all, don't do that. It's the least efficient way to water. But if that's what you're going to do, put a rain gauge in the middle of your garden, and again, that can just simply be a freezer container, and water your garden until there's an inch of water in that pan. That will tell you that you gave it enough water. And if you're watering evenly back and forth across your garden, not favoring your little rain gauge, right? When it's an inch full of water, you gave enough water to the garden. The other, I don't recommend that. That wastes half of the water you're applying, okay? But it is a way to know whether you did enough. What I would recommend is take the hose to the garden, take a bucket to the garden. Fill a 5-gallon bucket with water and water 5 or 6 plants directly with that 5-gallon bucket. Okay? That way you're giving each plant about a gallon of water right on top of it. Okay? You're not losing half of your water to evaporation and runoff. That's how you water a garden properly. Okay? Now, also at planting time, you need to think about fertilizer. Your fertilizer has, whether it's organic or salt-based, I don't care, this is true of all of them, has 3 numbers on it. They're the NPK numbers: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or potash. Okay? For a very crude way to think about that, think about the first number as pushing leaf growth, the second number as pushing flower and fruit, the third number as pushing roots. So when you're expecting a harsh year climate-wise, you want to favor the potash and lean away from nitrogen. What's going to happen if you put like any of the triple numbers, right, where you have even quantities of everything? Those are great in a wet year, but if you put those down on most garden plants in a dry year, you're going to just smoke your garden, because you're going to force it to produce top growth at the expense of roots. It won't root as deeply, it won't be drought tolerant, and it's going to lose extra water because it has extra leaf area. Okay? In a dry year, what's going on underneath the surface is far more important than what you see above ground. So instead of something like a triple 10, triple 15, triple 20, use something like a 5, 10, 10, or even a 0, 20, 20 as your fertilizer source. You could even just put straight potash down. Okay? Go light, because all of these are, especially with salt-based fertilizers, because they do, the dissolving of the salts does compete with your plants for moisture. So you want to make sure that you go a little light and water it in. And don't apply any fertilizer after your initial planting. If you come back in June or July and your plants aren't doing well and you think you need to fertilize, just stop. Okay? They need water, they don't need fertilizer. Okay? Applying fertilizer under drought conditions is one of the worst things you can ever do. Just water them more. If you had good soil fertility when you started to plant, you have good soil structure, you have good soil composition, you prepared your beds well, we'll talk about that in a minute. They'll have plenty of nutrients to get them through the season. Will they underperform? Probably, but they won't be dead. And nothing underperforms the way a dead plant underperforms. Okay? So don't fertilize mid-season if you're having a drought year, unless you're really willing to irrigate and measure your irrigation. And by really irrigate and measure your irrigation, I mean every other day minimum. Okay, if you can't make that commitment, don't fertilize. Okay? If you insist on fertilizing, or your neighbor insists on fertilizing, give them something like bone meal that you can't screw up with and won't compete with the soil, with the plants for water in the soil. Bone meal takes 6 months to really have its full impact, and it's not salt-based. So something like that will not compete with your plants for the water. You can get away with that. It won't do anything until next season, and that's why you can get away with it. Right? So if you just want to think you're doing something, do something for next year by putting bone meal down. Okay? Now, that brings us to bed preparation. There are two methods that I strongly recommend when you're expecting a drought year: double digging and hugelkultur. I have separate videos on those. I will make sure that those populate the end screen at the end of this little talk. Okay, so you can go right to them. Also, methods like planting potatoes. I'm sitting right beside one of my potato gardens. Planting potatoes in trenches filled with compost is sort of de facto double digging, right? So this counts too, which is why I chose to film this little clip here. Those two methods will store large amounts of water in the soil so that you get the maximum use of all the water that is actually delivered. Okay? Do that. After you've planted, or if you're watching this and you've already planted and you're thinking, drat, I listened to this, I went to the double digging video, I see what you're saying, but I already planted my garden. I didn't do it. What do? Mulch, here's a technical term, mulch the ever-loving bejabbers out of your plants. Okay? What mulch should you use? Whatever's the most free. Okay? Mulch is mulch, right? For all practical purposes, mulch is mulch. Mulch is any organic material that shades the surface of the soil from the direct impact of the sun. Okay? Mulch can be compost. Mulch can be shredded bark. Mulch can be shredded leaves, as long as there's no walnut in it. Mulch can be shredded wood. Mulch can be whatever you flagged down a road crew and got chipped wood from highway clearing, right? Again, give it the sniff test, make sure there's no walnut in it. Mulch can be shredded newspaper. Okay, mulch is any organic material that will rot eventually. Don't use plastic mulch. Okay, but any organic material that will rot down by next season and shades the surface of the soil. Okay. What does it mean to mulch the ever-loving bejabbers out of your garden? It means 2 to 3 inches of mulch. Okay, so you're looking for, 3 fingers. 3 fingers of mulch across your entire garden. This is why I say go for cheap. If you're buying expensive, like painted bark mulches, like red mulch, black mulch, something like that, the painted mulches, they cost a lot of money. If you're buying those, you're going to be tempted to be chintzy and just give it a skiff on top, and that won't do you much good. This is why I say, this is not an aesthetic consideration. This is about shading the soil and preventing water loss. That will save you fully a third to half, depending on your climate, water demand for your plants. Okay? So whatever water they have will go almost twice as far in terms of garden productivity with a good coating of mulch. Okay? If you have perennials or shrubs, mulch can even be gravel. But that won't rot down, so don't do that on like an annual vegetable garden. Okay? But Easter Island has an extremely sophisticated system of gravel mulching perennial plants. And it works extremely well in a very dry climate. Right, so it's all about shade of the soil. Get whatever is available. What I will say, again, don't use plastic. Don't use anything which won't decompose on annuals. And don't use a real hot manure for mulch. Okay, again, that goes back to too much fertility in a dry year. That's bad. You'll force top growth. And manure is salty. Urine is salty. Okay, so manure counts as a salt-based fertilizer. Okay, for this conversation. Anybody can mulch at any stage of your garden. If you are watching this and it's already July and you've already have everything in and you're starting to see the drought set in, you can still go out today and mulch your garden. Okay? What else can you do to save water? Well, shade cloth and windbreaks. You can go and you can purchase, again, if you're watching this and it's July or August and you're watching your garden die in a drought year, you can still go today and get some shade cloth. Okay? Get 20 or 30% coverage shade cloth, string it up in the middle of the day. That will, again, shelter your plants from the desiccating sun and will extend the water resources that you have. Windbreaks are another one. You can use a tarp as a windbreak. You can get a cheap tarp, you can get some cheap stakes, and you can set up a windbreak. Set it up so that it blocks the most consistent desiccating wind. Here where I'm gardening, that's the west wind. So again, I'll link my hugelkultur videos in the end screen of this video. I set up my big hugelkultur so that it blocks the west wind. If you're watching this mid-season or in a future year, you already have your garden in, you can rig up a tarp to accomplish that same function, blocking the wind, blocking the desiccating western sun, which is the sun, the time of day that causes the most dryness, after it's crested zenith and is going down to the west. That's where you have the most desiccation. Giving some shade from the harshest sun, giving some shelter from the wind, that will extend your water resources. Okay? And then water to the maximum extent that you're able, willing, and allowed. If you're in a desert area that has water restrictions, there may be limits on how much you're allowed to water. Okay? So doing all of these other things will stretch that resource and time investment in your water. Okay? And again, if you're under drought stress, don't fertilize at all. The only fertilizer your garden's going to need if you're under drought stress is water. That's what it wants, that's what it needs. Okay? So, I hope that these tips have helped a little bit. I